So for those of you who were here for the last session on privacy, this is going to be a markedly different presentation. The last presentation was on what can we expect in terms of privacy and the digital age, and that was much more chic and with it in terms of cutting edge and what's going on the day-to-day. What we're going to talk about now, it will be a little bit drier, but it's actually much more established, and will be basically about corporate law in the United States, but I think in general, when we think about corporations, what are the sort of things we should be thinking about? And I'm going to take another poll, but I think the answer is going to be relatively similar. Again, anyone in the room studying law? Okay. All right, then the other question is business. All right, good. You will run into this all the time. And you are the people that need to understand not just the nuts and bolts of how things are done, because that's what you hire lawyers for, but thinking about what your big scheme plan is for how to plan a business. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. In the intro earlier, when I was talking about the company I worked for, what I didn't get into is what I did before I joined this company. And I used to work at a very large international law firm where my job was mergers and acquisitions and financings. So I did everything from early stage funding for companies at $1 million or less to multi-million, billion-dollar deals where people were buying and selling very large companies. I did everything from selling airplanes to China to negotiating contracts with the government of Rwanda. I've done a lot of different things in that role as a corporate lawyer, which is what makes it a lot of fun, but there are some very basic building blocks that you have to have before you can go forward in business and with corporate law in general. So I'm happy to field questions throughout. This is a little bit less participatory than the last one, but if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to talk about them or talk about them at the end. Okay? So what we're going to talk about today is a very practical view of what business law is. In layman's terms, we're going to talk about business for the lawyer and law for the business person. From my experience, any good lawyer, sort of in my shoes, does not just tell you what the law is. They talk to you about things within the realm of business. What does it mean for your company? What are we talking about in terms of short-term strategy, long-term strategy? We're going to talk a little bit today about core business concepts. And by this, I'm not saying that we're subsuming any of your training here. At IBSU, I know you're getting very good training in terms of your career, but thinking about business concepts without the business terminology, right? Just basic concepts for somebody like me who doesn't have an MBA, unlike Albert, and for someone like me who just wants to understand the business cycle before I can do my legal stuff, okay? And then we're going to go through a familiar case study, which you all will remember from last hour, okay? So, practical definition, right? What is business? Business is the idea that you're trying to maximize, right? You're trying to maximize whatever your profit is, whatever your gain is, sort of generally, right? What is law? Law is minimizing risk, minimizing your chance of failure, right? So the business person thinks, wow, what can I do? How can I do it? Get me there. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. And the lawyer is the person that sits in the corner nervous, right? That's usually me in the corner. But what about this? And what about that? And did you think about this? And did you plan for that? And it's the person that's saying, whoa, put the brakes on. That may not be the way to go because there are some certain pitfalls with that. So, it's the person that says, what if? And anecdotally, right, think about if you had a brand new sports car, right? What would you, thinking about your sports car, think about first? Right? So the business person would say, wow, how fast can it go? Where can I go? What can I do with this car? And the lawyer would say, did you put insurance on that car? Because what if you run into your garage? Who's going to pay for that? Right? Because I can't afford to buy another sports car. So it's thinking about the two of them together and how you can use law to mix together with your big goals and ambitions in business to do it in a safe way so that you don't end up rising to the top and then falling fast. Okay, so that's what business law is. And that's what I do day to day. So the concept, and this is the way I want to think about what is business and how do we use law in the framework, is the idea that you look at your assets, right? First and foremost, what do you have? And as part of the Seed of Hope lecture series, right, one of our themes, right, is growing one seed at a time, right? So here, right, here's my little plant. That's my asset, right? So the first step is evaluating. What is your asset? What is its value? What can you do with that? Second thing, and this is where the lawyers usually come in, is how do you protect it? How do you make sure that whatever you have continues to be what it is and doesn't get stolen from you, isn't taken, doesn't lose its value, right? The third is how do you grow it, right? Anything that you have that you're interested in having long term, you don't want it just to sit there and be static and stale, right? You want it to keep up with the times, you want it to sort of build with everything else that's going on in the market, otherwise you start to lose market share. Fourth, how do you capitalize on it? And so when I say capitalize, I'm actually using that broadly, right? Capitalize, I mean, how do you get return on it, right? So that's selling it, right? That's thinking about what your exit strategy is for your company. Are you just going to run your company forever, or is your goal to get to a certain level of financing, or is your goal to sell it, or is your goal to go public? All of those are things to be thinking about at the very beginning of your business so that you are planning in the very beginning, and everything you do builds up to that end goal. So the case study we're going to talk about is Facebook. I think I've talked about Facebook more today than I have in a long, long time. But I think it's a very relevant success story, in some respects, as to what it means to go from startup to multi-billion-dollar company within a very short period of time. And I'm not saying, and don't think that this is the case, I'm not saying that when Mark Zuckerberg came up with the Facebook idea, he had an entire business plan written out. I don't think he knew when he came up with Facebook that he was going to be selling advertising slots to people. I don't think he knew that that was going to be one of his huge revenue drivers. But as he was thinking, right, if we go backwards, thinking about these things, right, evaluate, protect, grow, capitalize your asset, right, here, from capitalize to evaluate, there's a question mark, right? So the question is, after I've capitalized, can I go and do it again, and do it again, and continue to build value? And I think that's what Facebook has done successfully. So this is just an interesting map, I think, given what we've been talking about. But what it basically tells you is where the most popular social networking sites are in the world. So this dark blue color, which is everywhere, that's Facebook. That is how prevalent it is. It is the most popular in basically all of North and South America. I don't know if you can tell, this area here is all a lighter blue color. So that is not Facebook. That is, does anybody know? Yes, I'm trying to look up the actual, yeah, it's V-Tectone, something like that. Yep, okay, and then if we look, actually Georgia, you can't, it's hard to see it. It's right here. It's Facebook, right? China has its own, Iran has its own, Japan, it's Twitter, and Taiwan has its own, for whatever reason. But the vast majority of them, it actually is Facebook. So this is a look at Facebook's stock price, right? Facebook launched within the past 20 years, and in July 2015, it was named as the fastest within the S&P 500 to reach a market cap of $250 billion. That is probably more money than they thought they were going to be making when they came up with this in their Harvard dorm room. Right, when a bunch of guys got together and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool to put pictures of people and we can become friends and do social networking? I don't know if they imagined that. Right, September 2015, they went well over $300 billion. So it's huge and growing and growing. Stock price, right, we're looking here at May 2012 up to February 2014. It's way up here now, right? But it started off not so great, and it continues to rise. So, like we talked about earlier, I'd like to ask, what is Facebook? Right. Anybody tell me what Facebook is?
It's a way to contact.
It's a way to contact people, okay?
And share your emotions, share your photos, videos, or anything what you want. Also, you can find some information about another people.
Right.
And extra.
So it's a lot about sharing who you are and connecting with other people.
Or hosting our expensive time.
Right, that too. Yes?
For me, mostly it's easier way to access some information than finding it on the website, which is
Right.
given.
Right.
Facebook gives some specific transcripts and some paragraphs, which is more easier for me to find some specific issue I'm looking for than finding on the website, which
Right.
is
Easier way to advertise.
Yeah. I think that's right. Someone actually told me the other day that students these days don't look at websites. I don't know if that's true or not. They said everyone just goes to Facebook. And if it's not on Facebook, it doesn't exist. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But Facebook is also a news feed, right? I think some people also use it for online shopping, right? It gives you suggestions of things you could be buying. And it's also just an advertising platform. So, if I'm looking at Facebook not as an individual user, but I'm thinking of it as a company, right? It's an opportunity for me to talk about what my company does. It's an opportunity for me to sell things, and also just to advertise broadly, right? To a very broad audience because everyone is using Facebook. So, let's see. In terms of valuing their assets, right? So, in the early days, Facebook didn't have much, right? It started with a couple of guys in their dorm room. And so here what I've put is sort of buckets of things that they could have had of value, right? What is their idea? What is their market, their partnerships, property, funds, and people? So early on, anybody? Idea, I think we get, right? Their idea was networking. And I use that loosely, right? Because at the time it was not networking. It was getting to meet friends and stuff like that. Market. Was there a market for this when Facebook came out?
No, their market was universities.
Yeah, their market was universities, but this didn't exist, right? No one was doing social networking. I think back then we had Friendster, and we had a couple others, but no one was really doing social networking. It was kind of a new thing. So their market was pretty low. Partnerships. Friends. Yeah, that's pretty much all they had, right? They were not affiliated with any big companies at that point. They just had their own people. Property, what'd they have? Nothing. Well, they had some technology, right? They had their coding, but other than that, nothing. Funds? Yeah, whatever they had in their wallet, pretty much. But what they had that most startups have and most startups build their business on is people, right? They had their friends, they had the people that were building it, but they also had their family and friends, right? So we often talk about first round financing for companies is friends and family. Right, that's the idea. I really want to start this company, so I call my mom. Mom, I really need some money. Can you please help me out? This is my business idea. And that's partially what they did. In the beginning, all their first funders were parents, cousins, friends, that sort of thing. Okay, it's hard to read the slide, so I apologize. But this basically lays out what we just talked about, right? In terms of what their asset was, what they had. So what I put here, right, their market demand. There wasn't really any non-physical social interaction site at that time, right? It was mostly email. But this is sort of an evaluation of what their assets are when they first started. It's different now, right? It keeps changing. So if they were to do this evaluation now, it would be very, very different. And what I'm suggesting is as you run your company, you have to keep doing this analysis over and over again. What is it that my company does to bring value to the market? And what can I do with it? So on to the next one, protection. Right, so if that's all they have, they just have some tech coding, do they need to protect it? The answer is yes. Right, if that's all they have, that and some money from their parents, what are they going to do with that and their big idea, right? Because stuff happens, right? And stuff happens circumstantially, but stuff happens in the market, right? If someone else came in and said, I want to do social networking, look at my code, and they just stole their code, that's an issue, right? Okay, so what kind of risks can you protect against? The ones that you can protect against are the ones that you can predict and that you can prevent. There are certain things that you simply cannot protect against. And those are the ones where, in contract terms, we put in what's called a force majeure clause. That's the idea if there is some sort of natural disaster, right? If you were to run some sort of manufacturing company and a hurricane happens, you can't predict for that. You don't know what's going to happen, right? But the things you can prevent and predict against are the ones that you should be protecting for. So taxes, that's a big one. I don't actually know how the tax system works here. In the United States, there's a famous phrase that Ben Franklin coined long, long ago. There are only two things certain in life. One is death, and the other one is taxes, right? So taxes are everywhere. And the United States is famous for having a very high tax rate, a corporate tax rate. The tricky thing about the corporate tax in the United States is that for many entities, it is not a single tax. Like if I say the tax rate is 35%, that doesn't mean that the tax I pay is actually 35%. Because depending on my company, I could get taxed twice. You get taxed when the money comes in, and then you get taxed when the money actually goes to you. So people are trying to prevent that because you don't want to keep paying your money, right, in taxes to the government, even though they provide good services. You want to have it back for your company, and you want to use that capital. Regulations. So if you are in a highly regulated industry, you want to protect against that, right? If there are certain aspects of your company that need to be run a certain way to comply, then you want to be aware of those and account for them. Loss of market share. Third-party liabilities. And this is one that's mostly for lawyers. That's the idea that something could happen and someone could sue you for it, right? Whether it's they slipped and fell because you didn't put a sign that said there's a puddle, or some sort of debt liability. All sorts of third-party things where people could sue you or come after you. Protecting against all of those you can do by contract and by law. Okay? So when we think about asset protection, there's a very long list of things you could do, but this is some of them, right? One is entity selection. And in Georgia, there's fewer types of entities than there are in the United States, but it's the same idea, right? That depending on what kind of company structure and form you choose, you can protect your company in different ways, including against taxes, right? Other things you want to plan for, corporate governance, right? You want to make sure that the way you run your company is going to protect against other liabilities. So the list goes on and on. Today, I just want to talk about entity selection, IP registration, and affiliations and partnerships. Okay? Okay. So selection of your entity type. The idea here, again, is to protect yourself from taxes and from third-party liabilities. So in the United States, there's two flavors of entities. There are unlimited personal liability, and there are those with limited personal liability. Anybody take a wild guess which one you prefer? Limited, right? This one is a vestige of the way we used to do business a long, long, long time ago. That's the idea. If something happens, somebody slips and falls on my property, I'm liable. Right? They can come after me. What that means is not that they sue me generally only. That also means that if I owe something as a result of that liability, they can come after my assets. They can come after my house, they can come after my car, whatever it is that is mine and in my name and possibly in my spouse's name, they have a right to. So this, avoid at all costs. Right? So if someone were to start a company and just not form an entity, not go to their local state office to register, this is what you have. You have unlimited personal liability. So first and foremost, start an entity. Go get it registered because you don't want to be left open to this, okay? General partnership is the same idea as sole proprietorship, except it's more than one person. So it's as if my friend and I got together, started a business, we didn't do an entity, it means we're both liable. So you have to split the cost no matter what happens. Under limited personal liability, there are three basic types. A limited partnership is an arrangement where there is a general partner and there are limited partners. The general partner is the one that takes all the liability, and the limited partner doesn't. They're shielded by their company. The general partner, if you're going to do a limited partnership, the general partner is almost always a corporation, right? Because you don't want a person on the hook for that, you want a company. Limited liability company is similar, except you don't have a general partner. In that instance, it's a bunch of people, they get together, they start a company, it's going to have limited liability. And the reason why you would have a limited liability company is that the ownership rights and the rights for governing it are very flexible. As we talked about last time, Americans are big on free market economy and sort of negotiating your own thing however you want to. So a limited liability company, we can get together and say, well, you know, if the sun is yellow today, then you have more protection than I. That would not fly in a court of law, but it's that kind of flexibility, right, that you can design it. The last one is the one that most people do because it's the most familiar, and that is a corporation, right? And corporations are very regulated and strict in terms of the way they're formed, right? Corporations have shares. Usually there's common shares and preferred shares. And then within the company, you have your regular site president, treasurer, secretary, and then you have your board of directors, right? And the board of directors is appointed by those people, okay? In the United States, all entities are registered at the state level. So what that means is that if I'm operating a company, I'm going to go to the Secretary of State and I'm going to form my company. Most people in the United States, if they're thinking long term, will register their companies in Delaware. Anybody know why Delaware? Delaware is the most corporation-friendly state in the United States. Delaware makes a huge chunk of money just on taxes they get from companies. So they write their laws that are very friendly to companies in order to get more money in. So that's why people would choose Delaware. That said, if you register in Delaware, like I could own a company that's a Delaware company, but do all of my business in Massachusetts. How do I do that? I have to register. So I would actually register in Delaware to incorporate, and then I would say, Massachusetts, I want to qualify to do business here, and I'd have to pay them an additional fee. It's all about the states getting fees. Oops. Okay, this is just highlighting the two that are most important. This is laying out the differences between corporations and LLCs. Given that those are the two most popular, I wanted you to have information about what they are and how they're run. There are two types of corporations. There is a C corporation and an S corporation. I don't know what the C in C corporation stands for, maybe common, but S corporation is because it's based on subchapter S of the Federal Income Tax Code. Subchapter S basically means that an S corporation only has one level of taxation. If you recall correctly, I said, well, if you own a company, the company pays a tax, and then when you take that money personally to use, you pay a second tax. If you own an S corporation, there's only one tax. You don't have to get taxed twice. So that is a complete pass-through, right? The trick, though, with an S corporation is that you can have only up to 100 stockholders, and none of them can be non-US citizens. So even if it's a corporation, it has to be a US entity. So that's the trick, and that's the reason why you don't see a lot of S corporations. But an S corporation is run basically the same way as a C corporation, except you get that one-time tax versus two. Again, LLCs, the great thing is it's a one-level tax. Instead of stockholders, you have members. They don't hold shares, they hold membership interests in your company. The reason, though, that people don't like LLCs is that LLCs don't usually go public. So if you wanted to become a public company, you would want to be a corporation, and you can't be an S corporation to go public. You have to convert into a C corporation. The great thing is, if you pick a type of corporation or a type of entity, you're not stuck that way. Okay, you can always change. Of course, there's a fee if you want to change, and you have to do some wrangling with your ownership structure, but you can always change. But if you're looking to quickly go public, the way to go is with the C corporation. Okay, so talking about Facebook, what kind of company do we think they were? Do we think they had personal liability, or was it limited liability? It was actually limited, right? Because they didn't want to hold on to that personal liability. What about, do we think they had a general partner? No. So actually, I'm gonna take what I said back slightly. When they very first started, it was personal liability. So that answer was correct. But they quickly realized they couldn't stay with personal liability and had to move on. Okay. These are the likely choices, right? Likely they had limited liability when they got around to it. So they'd pick an LP, limited partnership, corporation, or LLC. Because they probably didn't have a general partner, corporation or LLC. Did they have a creative equity structure? Were they with membership interests and that sort of thing? Probably not, probably a corporation, and they weren't an S corp. But here's what actually happened. They became a Florida LLC. Really bizarre. I don't know who gave them their advice, but in the beginning they started off in Florida, which makes no sense because they were not based in Florida, and they were a limited liability company. This, however, did not last long because they realized quickly that it wasn't going to get them anywhere. So over time, they became a Delaware C corporation, and that's what they are today. And in order to go public, that's what they needed to be. So we're going to talk briefly about IP protection, and then we're going to apply it to Facebook as well. Okay, so there are different types of IP and IP protections. The first is patents. A patent is something, it's a right and a protection you have for a novel invention or idea. It's the idea not that someone else cannot do it, but that they would have to pay you a royalty if they wanted to do the thing that you came up with. Copyrights are based on original expressions. So earlier we talked about potentially having copyrights on Facebook. Copyrights apply mostly to written works as opposed to art, but they also apply to art, they can. You would find copyrights in poems, in books, in any sort of expression, right? And then trademarks and service marks. Those are things that identify you, like right here. Right? This is the IBSU, I would assume, trademark, and it's what identifies this university from other ones. Okay? And then the last one is trade secrets. And a trade secret is only protected as long as it's secret. So you can't register it, because if you register it, it's no longer secret. Okay? That's the kind of thing you keep under wraps. So Coca-Cola, I actually just had a cup of it just now. Why does this company need IP protection? What Coke is famous for is their main thing is their trade secret. Yeah, they are famous for the trade secret of what goes into Coke. Because can anyone here name, like if you had to go home and make a bottle of Coke, could you do it? On top of that, Coke has a lot of IP, a ton of IP. So can anyone, based on this picture alone, what IP do you see? The shape of the bottle, patented, right? It's a patented shape. Anything else? Trademark, yep, there's a trademark. This bottle cap, there's a patent on that too. Right, there is a patent or a trademark on pretty much every aspect of this bottle of Coke. You don't think that when you're drinking a bottle of Coke, because none of us is in the running to become a competitor, but the competitors are all very aware of the IP that's there, right, and that it's protected. So, the same way we would say that there's an app for that, there is a patent for almost everything under the sun, okay? The tricky thing about IP is it's mostly country specific. So if I have a patent in the United States, that does not mean that I have any patent rights in any other country. So what you'll see with all these big companies, they know that this is happening and they prepare for it. So one way that we've dealt with it as a global community is PCT. It's the Patent Cooperation Treaty, which basically says that early on, if I think I have an idea, I can register with PCT, and that gives me the right of first priority to register in all the other countries that are PCT countries. And that's not every country. It's a lot of them. A lot of the developed world is in PCT, but not all of them. So that's one way to do it. Okay? Yeah, well over, it's in the many, many billions of dollars. Partially based on what the company is valued at, but this trademark alone, huge. How many people have seen trademark violations of the Apple mark? I think most of us have, right? I think I have some at home that someone gave to me. It's one of these things where they're not going to come after you necessarily, but we all know that this belongs to them, right, in terms of ownership. Right? This mark, not this mark in particular, but their entire brand, it's worth $146 billion or so. The company has a market cap, granted, of $604 billion, but if you think about that, a huge chunk of it is in the brand, right? And that's why you protect your brand. because you don't want people going out there and doing knockoffs, because it dilutes the value of your brand, and you end up holding less than you probably deserve in the market. When we talk about, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but when we talk about trademark, there's a huge market for losing those trademarks and for knockoffs for that very reason. But what happens with trademarks is you can lose them over time. One of the ways you can use it is if it becomes overused. So Xerox, who knows what a Xerox is? It's a copy machine, right? It used to be that Xerox was just the name of a company. But because copy machines became so synonymous with Xerox copies, Xerox basically lost value in its trademark. Because now people just say Xerox. Can I Xerox that? Can I Xerox that? But they don't mean with a Xerox machine, they just mean copy it, right? Same thing with Kleenex, right? When we say Kleenex, we actually mean tissue, right, for blowing your nose. But Kleenex has become so synonymous with that, and Band-Aid, all those companies, that they've actually lost value. So what you'll see with a lot of companies is they're protecting it. So even though you use their brand as a verb, they try and stop you because they want you to recognize it belongs to them and they don't lose value that way. Okay. These are the sorts of things and the sorts of people that you're protecting against. Patent trolls are people or entities that file patents and they come after you to say that your stuff violates their patent. Sometimes people are accurate when they say that, but a lot of times they're not. I recently settled a case where a patent troll came after us and said, well, I came up with that before you did. And of course, they said it right before their patent expired, right? So not surprising, they were trying to get some money out of it. But patent litigation is so expensive. I spent, not I personally, the company spent close to $3 million defending this case. He didn't have a valid claim, he was wrong, but he took us to court and we had to keep paying lawyers to get through it. $3 million later, I was able to settle the case for $800,000. So that's the sort of thing that happens. You know, I should have not had to pay anything. It should have been zero because he had no claim. But these are the sorts of things that you run into in business where people are trying to claim rights in IP that actually belongs to you or that belongs to the general market. A recent case actually was a patent where somebody said, I invented the internet. And he said, well, here's my patent, I invented it, now everybody owes me a royalty. Thankfully, he didn't win, because I think we'd have a lot of issues. All of our internet service providers would have issues. But people are out there that are making these sorts of claims. Okay? And then, of course, this is just a knockoff bag based on a Louis Vuitton trademark, which we see all the time. But partially, you know your trademark has value when people start imitating you. Okay? So Facebook. Like. Somebody said it, right? That's their like, thumbs up. And I don't claim to be familiar with the new ones, the Facebook emotion things, like the face. I don't know what they mean. But in these things, Facebook has patents, and Facebook has trademarks. Right? In the United States alone, Facebook has 505 patents. That's actually not that many, considering the realm in which they participate. And trademarks, only 138 in the United States alone. But it's everything from that big Facebook blue, they don't really use it anymore, but the blue sign that says Facebook, to that F that I put up here, to this thumbs up sign. Okay? So that's a little bit about protecting your asset. The next aspect is how do you grow your asset? So there are different ways to grow your asset. Funds are the main one that people want to talk about often. Right? And by funds, I'm talking about financing. Right? There are angel investors, seed funding. Right? It's called seed funding because you're at the very beginning, and like a seed, you're planting it and hoping it'll grow. And then after that, you end up with venture capital funding, private equity funding, and you don't have to go through all these stages, but many startups do because they're really strapped for cash and they're trying to get money any way that they can. Strategic partnerships and debt financing. All of these are ways to bring money into your company. All of them come at a cost, right? When you bring in a venture capitalist to give you funds for your company, they don't say, sure, have some money, right? They say, okay, well, actually, how many people have watched the TV show Shark Tank? Does that run here? Okay, only a couple people. The idea is, right, okay, I will give you however much money, and you're going to give me a percentage of your company. Not only that, you're going to give me a seat on your board, and you're going to give me control over certain aspects of how you run your business. That's what they do. And the idea is they have the cash to help you fund it, so you'll take it, right, because you need that in order to keep your company moving. So I'm actually not going to talk a whole lot about financing. I'm happy to talk about it later just because it's super technical. And I highly recommend hiring your local lawyer to help you. The other thing in terms of ways to raise funds is licensing, right? And you can do that if you have something of value to license. That's either a license in your IP or it's a license to certain areas of your business. And the last one I want to talk about is market share and reputation and growing that. Because when we talk about partnerships and expanding, doing R&D, as you grow that aspect of your company, the rest of your company can follow. Right? You want to become the market leader in your area. Right? So all of these, like we talked about earlier, all of these are in our social internet-based space. Right? But the winner, the clear winner today is Facebook. Right? And so how do they become that kind of market leader is really the issue. Affiliation makes a huge difference. Who are you affiliated with? Who is on your board of directors? Many of you may have heard the idea that all of us should have a personal board of directors. That's a personal group of people who give you objective advice. Usually you will put people on your board of directors that have experience in your industry, people that are influential, but people that are not just going to tell you what you want to hear. Right? They're the ones who are going to give you the straight story, tell you how the market works, and give suggestions about how you run your company. Partners, same thing. You want people who are going to be mutually beneficial to you and will not just sort of leave you hanging, right? Working together to build value together. One of the partnerships I actually wanted to talk about in an affiliation is Duke University, based in North Carolina. It was one of my clients when I worked at the law firm. And what I did with them was they wanted to be in countries other than the United States. So what we did was Duke, and I've done the same thing with Juilliard and other schools, Duke said, okay, I want to be in China. How do I do that? And one of the ways we did that was we found local officials in a city that really wanted to develop, and they said, okay, let's build a partnership and let's do this together. And we will put our city name at the back of your university, and we will start a brand new university in China. It'll have Duke's reputation behind it, but it'll be a Chinese university. And you know, together working on boards of directors, together working as a partnership, they were able to do that and bring value to both, right? And have a study abroad program, that sort of thing. It worked out really well for both entities. Okay, so when I talk about Facebook and I talk about affiliation making a difference, what very large country, if I were to flip all the way back, is Facebook not in? China, yeah. Facebook was banned from China in 2009. Any idea why? It's largely because of China's view of censorship. Right? Facebook doesn't want to be censored, and it's an entity that really cannot be censored in the way it functions. So they were actually banned from China in 2009. Since then, they're still banned, but they're building a greater rapport with the Chinese community and the Chinese government. So there is more and more demand for what they are doing and for bringing them in. And when I point this out right here, this is Tsinghua University. Tsinghua is one of the more famous of the universities. Also, they call themselves the MIT of China. And Mark Zuckerberg managed to find his way onto the board there. The idea being, it depends on who you know, right? We've all heard that phrase, depends on who you know. And so as he develops that affiliation, I would not be surprised if we saw more and more his presence and his company's presence in things that are happening in China. Who knows? I mean, I can't predict it, but based on that relationship, we would expect and anticipate that it would continue to grow. In 2014, I believe, he and Jeff Bezos and some other sort of internet gurus were able to invite one of the leading people in terms of internet regulation in China to the United States to be part of a panel presentation. So we expect and we would think that part of that is going to lead to more working together and a growth of the asset and the market that Facebook has, right? In terms of partnerships, right? Do we know of any partnerships that Facebook had? I'm sorry? I'm sorry. Instagram. Oh, they have. I didn't know they had partnerships with Instagram. That actually. Right. Right. And that was good for both parties. Right. They actually very early on worked with a group called AXA Group. And the idea there was they worked together actually to build social, digital, and mobile footprint. None of us really know AXA Group, but it worked out in Facebook's favor because at the time they were actually very good at what they did, but they had to work it out. Partnerships are very, very tricky because once you get together with another entity, the question is when you're successful, who owns it? Right? When you're successful, who gets what piece of it? And what happens if you stop getting along? Right? And so you could have the instance where you get sold off, you get spun off, right, like an Instagram or someone else. But what do you do when you have a problem? So, the Duke University context, we're not quite there yet. Right? They're still happily working together, but there may come a day where they say, well, who's giving accreditation, right? Who gets credit for what happens at this university? Okay. So every time you have a joint venture, these are the things you want to think about, right? Who governs it, right? Between you and me, do we really have a 50% share? Let's say I and my friend own a joint venture. If we each have 50% and he says color it red and I say color it blue, now what? We're at an impasse, right? So you have to set up ahead of time who writes the rules in terms of how things work, right? You think about IP ownership. Right? If two companies form a joint venture, who owns whatever comes out of that thing? Basically, and I guess jumping ahead, basically my advice and admonishment is always begin with the end in mind. Dale Carnegie made that phrase famous, right? But every time, and this is my view as a lawyer, every time you start something and working together, you think about what happens when it falls apart and how do we protect against that, right? So, the end goal always is to operate a successful business, right? To end up with profits, to end up with dividends for the owners. But it's also to provide the owners with an exit opportunity. So whether that's selling your stock in the company or that's selling the company itself, that could mean selling stock, it could mean selling assets, or to go public. All of those are options in terms of basically liquidating your value in the company, right? So what did Facebook do? They went public, right? And there's a lot of controversy actually surrounding the Facebook IPO. The reason being that some people say that they inflated their prices or that they had some partnerships that were not completely above board. But regardless, they went public in May of 2012, which is why the stock price on that chart started in May 2012. That's the only time you can track it. And then, shortly after that, it plummeted, as most do after they had their IPO. But they went public. And with going public, a lot of people would say, oh, that's my goal. I want my company to be public. Anybody know the implications of being public? What's the biggest downfall? That's true too. Actually, I wasn't thinking about that. That's true. You do lose your sense of ownership because there's now like a huge swath of people that are your owners, right? And by the way, your company is always beholden to your owners, not to the board of directors, the president, to your owners, your stockholders. But what I was actually thinking about is when you go public, like we talked about the last hour, everything becomes public. Or when you're a public company, at least in the United States, because of the Securities and Exchange Commission, you now have to tell people about what your company is doing. You have to tell people what you pay your executives. You have to tell them every time you do a material contract. All of that, it pays for lots and lots of lawyers because it's a huge area of law. But you have to disclose that. Every time there is something that would drastically change your stock price, you have to put it out there so that your investors know and the public knows. So what you lose as a founder and as an owner is some of that control, right? Not just the interest in the company, but control over being able to just do things the way you want to do them. You have to follow the rules very, very clearly and very tightly. Okay? So again, in conclusion, these are the 4 things you really have to think about as you're growing any asset, any business. I would argue not just a business, anything, right? You think about, what do I have? How do I protect it? How do I grow it? What do I do with it, right, after I do that? But legally, when we're talking about companies, these are the 4, and there's many, many others, ways that you can protect what you've built, right? Entity choice is a huge one. IP protection, huge, right? And then eventually looking at how are you going to fund and how are you going to exit, right? So all of those are ways to think about the entire life cycle of your business. Now, there are people in the United States that we call serial entrepreneurs. They're people, they just run a company, sell it off, then do the next one, right? Over and over and over again. And it may not even be in the same industry over and over and over again, but what they've become very good at is learning how to do this cycle, right, of evaluation, protection, growth, capitalize, and they get out and they do something new. And so as you think about your business career, I recommend thinking about how to do that, but how to do it with the right protections so that you don't fall. With that, I want to open it up to questions about corporate law, corporations, mostly in the United States. I know I didn't really touch much in this lecture about how things are run here. I can tell you a little bit that I know about the 2 types of corporations here, but other than that, I'm happy to talk about business law generally. Facebook makes the large majority of their money on advertising. Like Google, yes, Google to some extent is actually more helpful in that they have a lot of different apps. Facebook, if you look on that right side, pretty much everything on the right side of your screen in that banner section is being paid for. Facebook is selling targeting data about you and other people. And the people that are on that right side have paid for that data. So whether it's paying for you just to see it or paying for you to click it, a huge part of their revenue is based on that. So that's where that comes from. And every time you see a sponsored ad, any of that, that's where they're getting the revenue. Yeah, so there are different, well, it wasn't that much money actually for Facebook to pay that, right? It's only a drop in the bucket for them. There's different ways to think about it. I wouldn't know about the WhatsApp app in particular, what their plans are, because I'm not Zuckerberg. One thing is to take it off the market, right? It's no longer there, it's no longer a competitor. We don't want you using WhatsApp, we want you using Facebook Messenger, right? That's one way to think about it. Another way, I don't know what types of IP they had. That might be something they were trying to buy so they could integrate that IP into Facebook itself. There are many times people buy companies, sadly enough, they buy them at a premium in order to tank them. And I'm not saying that's the case here. There was an argument that when Google bought, I can't remember the name of the company now, the one with the goggles. Is that Google or Facebook? There was a virtual reality goggle, and everyone said, what on earth are you doing? And they said, well, we're going to use this in the future. And then they did nothing with it, right? So rumor was they bought it to tank it. But actually now they're doing stuff with it. So that it's not really clear. I think, from my perspective, having been in the business, my company has bought a lot of companies where we buy it and we think we're going to do something and we try and we fail because we don't have the right people or the right culture. And so it just disappears, right? It kind of depends on the evolution of the product, the evolution of the company. So it's hard to say, but M&A is a fascinating, exciting, and a lot of money passing back and forth kind of area that lots of us work in. So the question was, is there any advantage in launching on one exchange versus another? I think less and less so. It used to be that you would pick the New York Stock Exchange because that was the most secure and that was where everyone was playing. Part of it is a reputation thing. You want to be able to say, wow, I'm on the New York Stock Exchange, or wow, I'm on NASDAQ. For a long time, people didn't recognize the Hong Kong Stock Exchange as being a valid exchange. And so they would say, well, you're somehow not as reputable or somehow not going to grow as much, so that's why you ended up on the secondary exchange in terms of value. Part of it is driven by the culture of the investors, right? Before you go out on any IPO, you do a roadshow, and you get people to sign up ahead of time to buy huge chunks of shares, mostly investment companies. And when they do that, they'll say, well, we want to make this a creditable thing, put you on this exchange because we think we're more likely to get more buyers on that exchange. I think in the United States, for example, I think there's still hesitance to go to non-US exchanges, but that is changing in terms of where people are willing to put their money.